So, just very quick review. What is mullet theology? We've been in this long enough that you know Jesus in the front, party in the back. We've been through the Monster Ballad mullet, the America mullet, the Wrestling mullet, the Billy Ray mullet, and the Picture Day mullet. And tonight it is the Slater mullet. So why don't you give us a description of the Slater mullet?
The Slater mullet is all about dating and sex. The Jesus in the front of this mullet is keeping a few non-negotiables when it comes to dating and sex. And then the party in the back ignores true biblical purity. The Slater mullet lies to its wearers by saying, as long as you don't do these certain things, you're okay. It fails to address motives, thoughts, hearts, and the positive characteristics of godly relationships. It is a thou shalt not approach to dating, sex, and marriage rather than a thou shalt approach.
And the norms and the kind of rules can shift from generation to generation, from environment to environment, but still this understanding that, without really any serious thought of the biblical standards for these things, we just kind of have this, well, hey, don't cross this line. That's what the Bible has to say, is don't cross this line. And that line's different depending on your culture and your place. But now outside of that, the Bible really has nothing to say about dating and marriage. And so that's the Slater mullet in a description.
Yeah, so we have several mullet sightings for this mullet.
I'll bet you've heard some of these statements.
Yeah,
that we're
I'm sure you probably have. These often show up when adults discuss dating and relationship norms with the younger generation. In many cases, the theology of dating and relationships prevalent in the church has been shaped more by Bayside High than the Bible.
Bayside High is where A.C. Slater went to high school, for those of you who are not aware of that. Also want you to know every one of these statements are statements that Lindsay and I, most of the time, both of us have heard these statements from Christians, from people who claim to be followers of Christ, who were very involved in their local churches. These are statements these are not made up statements. These are things that we have heard.
So you've got the boys will be boys ideology, and this is where boys are going to lust after young women. They're going to say and do things that they shouldn't. There's nothing we can do to stop it, so why should we even try? Even the idea of they need to sow their wild oats.
That this is just kind of a part of growing up. Like, okay, yeah, well, so I know he's out with his girlfriend, and I know he's probably getting involved in some things he shouldn't be involved in, but what are you going to do? Boys will be boys. And that's kind of that idea that, this is just the way things go. And we tell them the right things to do, and we try to lead them in the right way, but at the end of the day, they're just going to do what they're going to do, which in some ways is true. Boys are going to be boys, girls are going to be girls, people are going to be people are going to do what they're going to do. But it's almost a surrender, and it's a statement of acceptance. Well, this is just the way things are, and indicated it is this is the way really things ought to be.
Yeah. So another sighting would be an adult speaking to a child asking, oh, well, who is your girlfriend or who is your boyfriend? Or seeing two children, interacting with one another with kindness or playing together innocently and saying, oh, is that your little boyfriend or is that your little girlfriend? The phrase reveals a very distorted view about what a girlfriend or boyfriend should even be and the purpose for dating and relationships like that. And they kind of neglect to realize the purpose is marriage. So it would be really crazy to ask a 3 or 4-year-old, oh, is this the person you're going to marry?
Right.
Is that the person you're going to marry? Are you planning to marry that person?
I can remember from a very early age pressure from adults, peers, not pressure necessarily. Nobody was kind of prodding me. It just kind of seemed the expectation that I would always have a girlfriend. I can remember that as early as the earliest memories I have. I can remember that just kind of thought that, you must have a little girlfriend down at school, And
This is from within the church.
From within the church.
Leaders,
my whole community was the church. I wasn't
Right.
around anybody who didn't attend a local church. And so, yeah, these were leaders, these were teachers, and I don't think they meant anything bad about it, but it kind of communicated to me that this was just kind of the way things ought to be.
Yeah, and the next two phrases are pretty disturbing, but they were both spoken to us directly from people within the church. One said that her father, this was the only advice that she got from her parents when thinking about the topic of dating or relationships. He said, just don't date a black boy or come home pregnant. Now, this is obviously a racist statement that also sets a really low bar for sexual purity, and it communicates that all sexual activity other than intercourse is fine, or really even beyond that, unprotected intercourse. Sexual intercourse is fine as long as it includes proper birth control methods, and that young women who do get pregnant shouldn't bother to come home.
So this is a phrase that, or some version of this phrase, that's very common. It's a parent's way of saying, we just don't want the hassle or the problems that might come along. As long as you're not causing us any issues or problems, then you can kind of do whatever you want to do as long as it doesn't become an issue for us or become some kind of scandal. And I grew up in an area where a lot of people would say, you can date anybody you want to as long as it's not a black boy or a black girl. And that was just kind of the thought process that was poured into people where of course that's obviously racist, but also the idea of you can date anybody you want to.
Right.
That's not a good idea. The Bible is very clearly not against interracial marriage. And so therefore, as Christians, we shouldn't be against interracial dating. We shouldn't say, well, you can date anybody as long as they're not of this race or of that race or this kind of person or that kind of person. But we should very much be concerned about the character of the person. We should be concerned about the godliness of the person. But that was really never emphasized in these conversations. But the other standard was really clearly communicated.
And then also in response to news of a father's son being sexually active, he says, at least my boy ain't gay. So he is okay with sexual activity, or at least promiscuity, as long as... Or maybe
viewing pornography.
Right.
The boy gets caught viewing pornography.
Right.
And it's almost a relief. Well, glad to know my boy's not gay.
And it communicates, well, we do have standards that we're not willing to budge on when it comes to sex. But unfortunately, those standards have been set by the culture around them and not by the God of the Bible.
So again, it kind of goes back to the boys will be boys. So there's a certain way of living that, teenage boys are just going to do what teenage boys are going to do. Now, as long as it's not homosexual sin, we're okay with the sexual sin, as long as it's not homosexual sin. And we're kind of relieved a little bit to know that our boy is involved in heterosexual sin. I've had multiple parents when I was in youth ministry share this kind of thought with me, and again, it just doesn't line up with the standards of Scripture.
Another one is, have your shotgun ready, Dad, when someone sees a beautiful young lady, and that's their phrase. This saying implies that the only way that dads can protect their daughters from the sex-crazed boys coming her way is to shoot them.
And we know that's not what they really mean. And what dad of a young girl has not thought, I better have my shotgun ready. I need to be ready to protect my young daughter. But we really need to step back and think through this. That what does that say about our daughters? What does that say about the kind of boys that they would have friendships with? What does that say about the kind of families or environments that we're going to put our daughters in that would cause them to have these boys that, we're going to have to fend off with a shotgun? And again, we know it's said out of fun, but it also communicates something. When you're a young girl and you hear that, it communicates something. I mean, imagine being 8, 9 years old and you're a young girl and you hear that. You think, well, why would my dad need to protect me from boys? That communicates to them that really once they get to a certain age,
boys are dangerous.
Boys are dangerous, and they are just a sexual object, and these boys are just waiting for their opportunity to be with this girl, and so the dad better have the shotgun ready. There's also a phrase for boys too.
Yes, that one's going to be a lady killer. Now, how awkward is that if some adult woman says that about your 4 or 5-year-old boy or 8-year-old boy or 12-year-old boy? If you role reverse that and have a man say something about a young girl like that, we would be calling the police.
Yeah.
But
now you need to be careful because this may be traumatic because most of the men in the room probably have heard this a lot. That one's going to be a lady killer.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's probably something that was generally said about them quite a bit. But
it definitely has a connotation that is in no way biblical and really usurps the idea behind biblical relationship, biblical marriage, and it really turns upside down the whole purpose of the relationship and puts emphasis on, just like you said earlier about the women, objectifying the young man, and then even the idea that It's okay for boys to be able to just date and date and date and pass girls by, and whenever they're done with them, just go on to another one. The idea lady killer, meaning breaking the hearts of who knows, hundreds of ladies. That's not an idea we even want to put in the mind of our young children, of our boys.
So we've talked about some of the dangers of this particular mullet, but let's talk about a few others. And I know you probably think, well, maybe we're being a little too picky. Maybe we just need to lighten up about this. But man, Scripture is so clear about the power of our words. Yeah. And so what we say matters. What we mean by what we say matters, and what children hear said about them matters.
Yeah. So Matthew 12:34 and 36-37 tells us, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will give account for every careless word they speak. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. That's a really staunch statement that I think sometimes we don't think about very much, about our words and how important they are. But I think you would think about it if it were dealing with you. So if your husband has no problem telling crude jokes about you to his friends, or saying things about you to make you look really bad, that definitely damages your marriage, right? That really damages your relationship and your intimacy with your husband, and even probably your own self-worth and the way that you look at yourself. If you're constantly being put down, even if it's a joke, even if he says, I'm just kidding, we all know that there is always a shred of truth to every joke, right? And so we have to be careful with our words. So we cannot look at the things that we're saying, and just because it'll get a laugh out of somebody, forget that it might actually be damaging the other person that's hearing it.
And so this is where the Slater mullet has really done or taken part in producing a confused and distorted view of sexuality among culturally Christian teens. So teens who are in the church, they're listening for, and you remember what it was like. I mean, when you're in that stage of life, you're hanging on everything. You're trying to figure this out. You're trying to figure out what this looks like. You're hoping and praying God will send you somebody to marry. And so you're kind of just trying to figure all of this out. And so you're hanging on every little thing you see and hear, especially from people who you're to look up to, like in your church, your life group leaders, your youth group leaders, your pastors and teachers. And so when we say these things that just are, even if they're just not necessarily negative, but they're just empty about dating and marriage, it really sets our teenagers up for failure.
Yeah, and then purity is no longer anywhere on the radar for them. They're really just looking for following these guidelines and these ideas that have been set out before them, rather than setting the bar of actual biblical standard of relationship.
And inside the church, it's either apathy or kind of banter about relationships but as far as substance, and you think, well, hey, the youth pastor's going to handle that. The youth pastor's going to have a 2 or 3 week series on dating, and that will handle that. That's not going to handle that. This is pretty constantly on their minds, and this is something they need constant reinforcement about. They need to get it, yes, from the youth pastor, but they also need to get it from all of us. They need to see it reinforced all the way around. They need to hear it from their parents. They need to see the godly people that they look up to in the church leading them in the right way when it comes to dating and marriage.
So let's look at the mullet makeover, Christ-centered principles to reshape your theology. One is that we would sow life rather than death, and this really goes back to even our words and the things that we think and we say. God will not allow our actions to mock Him, and when we have these kind of ideas that we are so quickly passing down to the younger generations, that is leading them to death and not to life. What He says leads to life really does lead to life, and what He says leads to death really does lead to death. And so we can't just sow seeds of death over and over and over again by creating our own version of what a biblical relationship would look like, or a good relationship, or a right relationship. We can't create our own seeds of death by doing that and expect life to spring up. So if we want to see life spring up in our own marriages or in our children's marriages and relationships, then we've got to follow the pattern that God set out for us.
So Galatians 6:7, you probably know it well. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap. So it's not just enough to just, raise them in church. Well, I'm raising them in church. Super important. Raise them in church. But also understand that we have a direct responsibility to our children and then to the children we're around in church. We've got to create the right environment in church to teach our children how to honor God in every area of life. That includes their hearts and minds. It also includes their bodies, that we have a responsibility to help them steward this thing that God has given them. So that's the first principle,
And
sow life rather than death.
that means being willing to talk about these important things with them appropriately at every stage of their development. It means not avoiding these conversations, but it also means knowing what they can handle. I've been reading The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom, and she talks about this experience with her father when she was a little girl, and she had heard someone talk about sex sins. And she asked him, "What are sex sins?" And she said, "I knew in my mind that sex had something to do with being a boy or a girl, and I knew what sins were, breaking God's law, but I didn't understand how those two words went together." And when she asked him about it, they were on a train ride, and he had a big suitcase of all of his things, and he thought about it for a minute, and he said, "When we get to our train stop, I want you to carry my suitcase off the train and into the train station for me." And she tried to lift it, and she couldn't. It was too heavy. And he said, "Corrie, some things are too heavy for you to handle and carry on your own, so I'm going to hold them for you until you're ready to hold them on your own." And he used that as a word picture for her to be able to say, I'll be able to explain these things to you when you're older and stronger and able to understand them. And so it's not to avoid the conversation, but it's to handle it appropriately at each stage.
And it should be at each stage. For us, for parents and for Christian church, there is no sex talk. There are ongoing conversations at age-appropriate levels where we sow biblical truth in at every level. And it's the same biblical truth we're sowing in when they're 4, 5, and 6 years old as we're sowing in when they're 14, 15, and 16 years old, but it's in different ways, and we're communicating in different ways. So it's not a one-and-done talk. Right. It's an ongoing conversation you have with your children throughout their entire life, even on into adulthood. So we need godly counsel, which leads to the second principle.
Yeah, so the second principle is godly counsel rather than good old boy counsel. Your kids don't need another good old boy patting them on the back after their first date, asking them if they got a kiss. They need godly counsel and wisdom, and we've got several resources we would love to point you to. One of those is Mama Bear Apologetics, empowering your kids to understand and live out God's design, as well as their sequel book, which is a guide to sexuality. Both of these books are excellent resources for parents and anybody with the influence over a child, and honestly for your own understanding and realization of how God designed these relationships to be. I know many of us would probably have the same testimony in that you may not have felt like you were even prepared well for a biblical relationship or biblical marriage, and I know that a lot of people that have grown up within the church have the testimony that it was not spoken about in their home. They felt for years in their marriage they had a difficult time walking through what it meant to have biblical intimacy with their husband or their wife because they were just taught incorrectly about sex and intimate relationship with their spouse. So these two books are really great resources. And then Desiring God actually has a website that offers lots of articles and podcasts and sermons and books on the topic of sexual purity as well. And then there's one other book that's not listed here that I would also recommend. It's by Mo Isom, and it's called Sex, Jesus, and Conversations the Church Forgot. And this is really her story. She was raised in church, and just like Derek mentioned a minute ago, she was never really intentionally guided to understand what true biblical relationships looked like. And so she was always left wondering, like, how should I live my life? What should I do in these situations? And she just really did a great job of kind of mingling her story and the mistakes that she made with a charge to us not to make those same mistakes in leading our children and helping them understand from a biblical perspective.
So those are great resources. Those are great books. Guys, it's okay to read a book called Mama Bear. It's actually got a lot of good material in it. But ultimately, this has got to come from us. This can't be hey, here's a book, go read this. Or really, that's to equip you as parents. We've got to have these conversations. As Christian parents, our children have to know that we can have these conversations. I've found throughout my years in ministry that parents are really reluctant to talk about these things, many times because their own past is not something that they want to talk with their children about, but you've got to get over that, and you've got to have these discussions. We've kind of bought the lie, too, that we need to have, and listen, we're in a world where parents get too much in their kids' lives in some ways. I mean, we're in a world where parents want to walk out on the field and tell the coach how and when to put their kid in the game, or we want to get all up in the business of our children for whatever reason, except when it comes to marriage. We've bought into this lie that one of the most important decisions that a kid will ever make, a young man or young woman will ever make in their life, that we're to kind of back off and let them find true love and let them figure it out on their own. And that when they find true love, or when they start dating, and this might be their one true love, which is another Hollywood lie, that then they'll let us know, oh, I think I've found the one, and then we get involved when it's time to plan the wedding. That's kind of how we picture things. That is not the biblical model. In fact, you should probably just let your football coach, your kid's football coach, handle everything on the football field. And you should really probably do a deep dive on this whole love and marriage thing to make sure that your kids are properly equipped to move into this stage of life.
Yeah, and so as parents, it's our job to offer godly counsel to our kids through this process. And that begins by modeling a healthy marriage yourself and strengthening your marriage and allowing God to make your marriage be what it was created to be, which is a demonstration of his relationship with the church. And then it continues by helping them learn and understand God's design for relationships in the pressure cooker of puberty. I mean, we can't ignore the fact that there are hormones that are entering into their body that make things really difficult for them. And they don't know what's going on. We don't know what's going on. And so it's really difficult to maneuver a lot of that sometimes. And so by starting the conversations young and keeping the conversations going, it really is very, very helpful in all of this. And then extending biblical guidance as they consider dating, courting, or marriage as young adults. Knowing the right questions to ask them. Knowing the benchmarks to set in front of them and say, these are the things you need to be consistently doing in order to show that you are ready for this next season of your life.
I know this is probably very different than the way that our culture has shaped our thinking. But if your child lives at home, 15, 16, 17 years old, they should not date anyone or spend extended amount of time with anyone that you've not approved. Oh no, I can't get involved in their dating life. See, that's that lie coming back to you again. Why would you not get involved in their dating life? Why would you not, if they come to you and say, hey, I'm dating now, or you say it's okay for you to date, why would you take the hands-off approach of just let me know how that works out, and I'd really love to know next week who you went on dates with last week? Why would you take that approach? Instead of saying you are a 16-year-old young man or young woman, you can't properly evaluate who would be a good person for you to date right now. I want to help you learn the questions to ask. I want to help you learn how to see this through a biblical lens, and I want to help you make good decisions, because one day you're going to have to make these decisions on your own. And so I'm not going to let you go from 0 to 60 and all of a sudden you're just making all those decisions. I mean, we don't even do this with cars, right? Oh, you're 16 years old, you've never driven a car, but you passed your driver's test, here are the keys. No, we put them in the passenger seat. We drive around. We talk about things. We say, hey, why don't you drive through the neighborhood a little bit? Hey, why don't you get used to doing this in the driveway? I mean, we start them when they're little kids, right? We put them on their laps. They hold the steering wheel. They do the blinkers and all those kind of things. We talk about all these things and we ease them into it long before we ever say, just jump in the car, head out, and go wherever it is that you're going, because we realize a car is a very dangerous thing. So can be dating and marriage and relationships. We've got to take the same approach.
And then the third way is to use careful words rather than careless words. So weigh your words carefully and don't just let them gush evil. The hearts of the righteous ponders how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours out evil things. Proverbs 15:28 says.
So it's gushing out evil things. We don't want to gush out evil things. We want to gush out good things. And then we're reminded, Proverbs 18:21, death and life are in the power of the tongue. What we say really, really matters. There's a lot of death in relationships right now. If you look around in our culture, you look at marriage, you look at relationships, dating, this whole area, we don't know what we're doing as a culture. That's clearly the case. So if we just let the culture shape the way they think on this, then we're setting them up for failure. And our tongue can be the difference in them hearing words of life or words of death.
Careless words can reveal transgression, Proverbs 10:19 tells us. They're out of place in God's kingdom, Ephesians 5:4 tells us. They can cause mass destruction, according to James 3:1-18. They're an abomination to the Lord, according to Proverbs 12:22, and they can condemn you, according to Matthew 12:37.
So we want to encourage you to choose to give life with your words, but that can only happen when you have life at the source of your words, which is your heart. So this all starts with getting our hearts right in these areas, with really checking where we are when it comes to any area, but especially in this case, dating and marriage. And so Luke chapter 6, verse 45, the good person out of the good treasure of his heart produces good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure produces evil. For out of the abundance of the heart, his mouth speaks. So really, maybe the first place we start is with that prayer that David prayed in Psalm 51:10, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Get our thinking about this right, and then transfer that to our children.
And one reason why this matters so much is because, like what we've said earlier, marriage is meant to reflect Christ's relationship with the church. It all builds up to that, right? That should be the purpose of dating and romantic relationships. And so if we are not handling that well on the front end, then we're not ending up with marriages that reflect the relationship of Christ and his church. And we're ending up with a lot of hurt and damaged people. We're ending up with a lot of tension in families, tension in relationships, broken families. I think now there are more broken families than not, even within the church. The statistics tell us that there are more families that are broken than are not. And so that is a really sobering statistic to me.
I heard a statistic. I have not verified this. I think I shared it in here before, but that only 30% of kids, 18 or younger, only 30% of kids are in a home where mom and dad have been married, stayed married to the same people. Only 30% of kids, which really is shocking because you go like, well, there are fewer and fewer traditional or normal families. Well, if we've got to the point where 70%, then normal has been redefined. And actually the 30%, that's abnormal. So mom and dad are married and have children in the home is the abnormal thing now. And that is as much of an impact. I mean, think about that, where we were like at 40 or 50% 20, 30 years ago, and see what kind of damage that caused. Some of you, have even shared it tonight. Like, hey, this was the situation at my home. It caused this kind of damage. What is a 70% rate going to cause in over the next couple of decades? So we've got to fight against the culture. We can't change the culture, but we can be a part of getting it right for us.